Hello, I am Ercan Ayboga. I welcome you to this event called When is the Next Pandemic Coming? Eco-Analyze from the USA. We are very happy to welcome you from Germany or abroad, from all over the world. It's a talk with David Quammen, a journalist and author from the United States of America. David, welcome. Thanks to agreeing speaking with us. I'm sure you're very requested in these weeks. The subject is, as I said, the COVID-19 pandemic, but not only this pandemic, which affects all of us, actually all humans in this world, in a way which never have happened before. David writes for his whole life, very regularly for the National Geographic. For around 20 years, he does investigations on zoonotic diseases and has published several books. One of them is Spillover, Animal Infections and the Next Human Pandemic, which is a New York Times bestseller and has been awarded twice. And the other one is Ebola, the Natural and Human History of a Deadly Virus. As said, I'm Ercan Ayboga. I'm from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, which is the host of this event, digital event. This foundation is one of the major 6 political foundations in Germany, tasked primarily with conducting political education in Germany and internationally. So what we are doing now. So in doing so, the foundation follows a left-wing and a critical line. You listeners, the audience, you have the opportunity to ask questions to David Quammen through our chat function. There's in the comment function in Facebook. Use it. You can write also in advance. You can send your questions or short comments. We will direct them to David. I give now the word to David. David will have an intervention of 10 minutes. Then I will follow with some questions. And after this, your questions will follow. So David, please.
Thank you very much, Ercan. Thank you. And thank you to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I hope this will be a conversation. I'll start, as Ercan said, I'll start by making a few remarks. And Ercan has some questions for me, but we welcome your questions too. And I apologize for the fact that we're doing this in English. I wish I could also do it in German, but my German is not ready for that. So I'll start by, our goal today, I think, this evening is to try and put COVID-19 into a context, into a broader context, so we can both understand this event, this pandemic disaster, and understand a little bit better the world before it and after it, to have a sense of how this has happened to us and how we can prevent something like this from happening in the future. So Ercan mentioned, I've written a book on zoonotic diseases. COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. What is a zoonotic disease? A zoonotic disease is an animal infection that's transmissible to humans. Could be a virus, could be a bacterium, could be a parasite like the malaria parasite, could be a fungus, could be any sort of a pathogen. We call that a zoonosis if it passes from a non-human animal host into a human. And once it's in the human, if it causes disease, we call that a zoonotic disease. Now, this is not a small subject out on the fringe of medical concern. This is central to human public health because at least 60 to 70% of all of our infectious diseases fall in this category. They are zoonotic diseases. That's in the strict sense, 60 or 70%. And if you interpret it in a broader sense, then virtually all of our diseases are ultimately zoonotic. Why? Because we are a young species, only about 200,000 years old. Viruses and bacteria have been around much longer than that, and everything comes from something. So when we appeared as a new species, evolved, we began having contact with other animals, with wild animals, and we became exposed to their viruses and other pathogens, and those were the first zoonotic diseases. Some of them are old, like bubonic plague is a zoonotic disease, and some of them are new and dramatic, like Ebola virus disease, and Zika virus disease, and MERS, and the original SARS that spilled over from bats into humans in 2002, 2003 in southern China, spread across the world, and it's related to this current virus. We can talk a little bit more about that. So we have zoonoses, these pathogens that live in non-human animals. In some cases, they live for millions of years inconspicuously without causing notable disease, as far as we know, and continue to live inconspicuously in their wild animal hosts. That we call those the reservoir host. That's the term for it, reservoir host. That is the kind of animal, species of bat or a species of rodent or a species of some other creature, a primate. The reservoir host is the kind of animal in which the virus or the other pathogen lives inconspicuously over long periods of time without causing notable disease. And then when a human comes into contact with a wild animal, a reservoir host that's carrying a virus, if that virus falls into humans, gets into humans somehow, we call that moment the spillover moment. It spills over from the wild animal host into humans. If it finds in this new environment, the human body, that it can replicate and replicate abundantly, then it becomes a disease. If it can transmit from one human to another, then it becomes a transmissible human disease, an infectious disease, and potentially an epidemic or a pandemic. So that is where these things come from. There have been more and more of these spillovers over the last, let's say 60 years. Going back, I mark it to around 1961. There was a virus called Machupo virus that spilled over from rodents into humans in Bolivia and caused a terrible disease, Bolivian hemorrhagic fever. 1967, there was Marburg, which is related to Ebola, that spilled over from monkeys into humans. Why is it called Marburg? Because these were monkeys from Uganda, but they were shipped up to Marburg, Germany, to a laboratory. And in the laboratory, they infected people with this virus, a filovirus related to Ebola, a very, very dangerous virus, killed a number of people in or associated with the lab in Marburg. So that's Marburg virus. And then its cousin, Ebola virus, appeared in 1976 in what then was Zaire, now is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Terrible disease, but not as infectious as this disease. And then there have been a number since then. AIDS, HIV was recognized, been in humans longer, but it was recognized in 1980, 81. In 1994, there was Hendra virus in Australia coming out of bats, passing through horses, getting into humans. 1998, in Malaysia, there was a Nipah virus coming out of bats, passing through pigs on large industrial pig farms, getting into humans, killing people, transmitting from human to human. 2003, we had the first SARS epidemic, a virus, as I said, coming out of southern China. Also, the reservoir host for that was bats, we now know. And it passed through an animal called the civet, the palm civet, which was being raised, in some cases captured and in some cases raised in captivity for food. The civet was what we call the intermediate host or the amplifier host. Reservoir host was a bat. The virus got into civets. Civets carried the virus as an intermediate host or an amplifier host, and then civets gave it to humans. So there's been a whole sequence of these things. And now we have COVID-19 caused by a new virus, a coronavirus that we call SARS-CoV-2. much of this was predictable to scientists. And I repeated their predictions. I described their predictions in my book, Spillover, in 2012. Would there be a next big pandemic? Yes, there would be, they told me. And I said, what will it look like? And they told me it will be a virus that comes out of an animal, a wild animal, possibly a bat. What kind of virus? Well, one that evolves relatively quickly and adapts quickly to a new host, possibly an influenza or a coronavirus. Where might that happen? Well, someplace where humans come in contact with wild animals, for instance, a wet market, where, oh, well, possibly in China, where there are wet markets with wildlife. All of that was predicted. And I reported those predictions 8 years ago. Scientists knew it. Public health officials knew it. Political leaders ignored these warnings because it was expensive to be prepared. And they were calculating their own political interests, thinking that they shouldn't spend money preparing for a pandemic that might not happen during their term of office. And so many countries in the world, including most conspicuously mine, the US, were unprepared for this. They didn't need to be unprepared. We didn't need to be unprepared. It was political mistakes, bad leadership. It wasn't science. We had the science. We understand these things, where they come from. This one was predictable. We can also predict that this will not be the last one. So we need to learn from this. We need to get this COVID-19 pandemic under control, and we can talk about that. And we need to learn from it once it's over. As soon as we get this under control, as I've said elsewhere, we should celebrate for 5 minutes and then start preparing for the next one. So I'll pause there, Ercan, and happy to take some questions to touch on different aspects of this from you and from the people who are joining us.
Thank you so much, David, for this introduction. Yes, there are many questions. Actually, the most people have so many questions, and the whole society is asking questions. There are some answers, and what we are missing is that many answers come not from experts, and experts have different opinions, so it's a difficult situation. But I have a question about the coronavirus. I guess it's a group or family. What makes it different from the others?
Yes, that's a good question. So coronavirus, as you say, is a family of viruses. There are a number of them. We know of 7 of them that infect humans. And 4 of those are very mild viruses that simply cause the common cold, different versions of the common cold. 4 coronaviruses. We've known about them since the 1960s or so. There are 3 other coronaviruses that are very, very dangerous. The first is the original SARS virus. The second is the MERS virus. And the third is this one, the COVID-19 virus, which is officially called SARS-CoV-2. Coronaviruses are dangerous for a couple of reasons, but one is that they evolve rapidly. They have the potential to evolve rapidly, as I said. Why is that? 2 reasons. One, they have a relatively high mutation rate. So when they copy their genomes as they're replicating inside of a host, they get inside the cells and then they replicate themselves. That's what viruses do. They attack and they invade cells of animals or plants or fungi and make replicas of themselves, and then they burst out of the cells and cause disease and make more copies. When they replicate themselves, coronaviruses make mistakes in replication. Why? Because they are single-stranded RNA viruses. Each different kind of virus has a genome. It could be a DNA genome, a double-stranded DNA genome with double helix, the famous double helix. Could be a single strand of DNA, could be a double strand of RNA or a single strand of RNA. RNA is a different molecule related to DNA. It's involved in the process. It's involved in several different kinds of processes. But this genome is a single strand of DNA. And when it copies itself, it makes mistakes. in the letters of the genetic code that it puts into place. So if it makes, if it puts into place an A letter instead of a T letter, then that's a mutation. And that most mutations are negative for the virus, or negative for the organism. But out of every, who knows, 1,000 random changes, there might be one that actually makes the virus more fit for its environment. And so it's mutating a lot. It's random variation. It's Darwinian natural selection. And this variation, the viruses, the particles are competing against one another, and it's the survival of the fittest. So because coronaviruses have a high mutation rate, and because they follow Darwinian survival of the fittest, they are capable of adapting fairly quickly to new environments, such as a human being, as opposed to another kind of animal. They also, they recombine. They can break apart into segments and then recombine with another segment of a coronavirus that's infecting the same animal. Now, I don't want to get too deeply into that, but those two processes are probably very important in having created this coronavirus. People are still wondering where this coronavirus came from. The answers involve this capacity to mutate and to recombine segments, because this virus seems to have come from a couple of different viruses that perhaps were living in a couple of different animals and then got into one animal and recombined, came out of that animal, very, very well equipped to infect humans.
So can we say that in different countries we can have a different stage of development of this virus, or will it get us something similar on a global level? Is it?
It's very possible, because this virus does mutate, it's very possible for it to evolve and for there to be different branches on the tree of life of this virus. There might be one strain in Germany that's different from the strain that's in Brazil, or different from the strain that was originally in China. This is entirely possible. And scientists have been watching for this. How do they watch for it? They take samples from infected people at different points in time and different points in space. Early in China, and a little bit later perhaps in Germany, and then later still in Brazil. And they sequence those samples of the virus, sequence the genome, and they compare them with their high-powered computers. And they build a tree. And there might be branches that are spreading apart as the virus is evolving in different ways. But this tree, so far, the scientists are saying, looks like this. All of the branches are very close together. I don't know, maybe like a Lombardy poplar. I don't know what your term is for a Lombardy poplar, but you know what I mean by a Lombardy poplar, right?
Yes.
So that's what this tree of life looks like. It's all bunched together. So although this virus has a high mutation rate, it doesn't seem to be changing very much. The scientists ask, why isn't it changing? Why isn't it evolving? And the answer seems to be because it doesn't need to, because it's already so successful. So the limbs are bunched together because that avenue of possibilities right in the middle is very successful in terms of the number of humans it's able to infect. It doesn't need to try something else and send a branch out in this direction. If we get a vaccine, I hope we will get a vaccine. So when we get a vaccine, we will stop that successful avenue. We will block it. And then we can expect that branches of evolution might turn out to the sides, and the virus might, it doesn't attempt in the sense that it has purposes, but random variation and natural selection might cause the virus to evolve in different directions. So we can expect when we get a vaccine, the virus might show some possibility of evolving around the vaccine. But the scientists hope that it won't do that very quickly. It won't do that within a year. It might do that within a few years. So that's where we stand now.
Okay. Here I have a question. Can we say this happens today or in these years or decades with the Ebola virus? Ebola sometimes disappears and comes again out.
Yeah. Well, Ebola is a very interesting case. It's a very, very lethal virus. It kills about 60% of the people that it infects, but it doesn't transmit nearly as well as this virus. It's not nearly as contagious as this virus. It requires, almost without exception, contact with liquids, contact with blood, contact with diarrhea, contact with vomit. And so that's the way it's transferred. It doesn't fly through the air on a sneeze or a cough, and it doesn't do what this virus does, which is pass from people who show no symptoms on a spoken word or a breath. That's what makes this virus so very dangerous. Ebola can't do that. So when there's an Ebola outbreak, as terrible as it is, people come in and they work to stop that outbreak. And once they get it stopped, once they get the last person cured or the last person has died, then Ebola is not in humans anymore. That means it's still in its reservoir host somewhere in the African forest. It's not that it goes back there, it's that it has remained there the whole time while some members of its virus population have been infecting humans. When you stop all the members of the population that are infecting humans, it still abides, it still resides in its reservoir host. And so Ebola is still there. Ebola will come back. And this virus is still somewhere in its reservoir host also.
So now we are touching a question which is posed everywhere. How could be the development in the next weeks and months and 1, 2, 3 years? So everybody asks this, if we don't have a vaccine. So which possibilities do we have? What is possible?
Yes. The honest answer is nobody knows, because there's so many levels of unpredictability. There's political unpredictability, there's human individual behavior, there's the behavior of the virus, among other factors. There's also weather unpredictability, whether we have hot summers or cool summers or mild winters or not. All of that will determine what this virus does. So I can't tell you an answer to that question, but can I guess like everybody else? Yes, I'll certainly guess. My guess is that we will have a vaccine within a year or two. My guess is that between now and then, we will have a roller coaster, not just a second wave of infection, a second surge, but a second surge followed by stringent measures, again, of public health, social distancing, contact tracing, confinement, isolation of cases that will bring it down, and then a third wave. That's why I see a roller coaster. I see this thing not going away. I suspect that it will continue to attack us whenever we let up our guard. However, will it be as transmissible in warm months, in the summers of the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere? You know, Brazil is going into winter now, and we in the northern hemisphere are going into summer. So maybe that's part of the reason why it's getting so bad in Brazil. Maybe the summer, when people are outside, when the air is warm and dry, what will happen will be similar to what happens with influenza. Influenza doesn't do well in the summer. But we don't have any guarantee that this will behave like influenza. When people talk about that, they're talking about the experience from influenza. With this virus, we have no experience of that, so we don't know. But that's my guess. My guess is a roller coaster until we get enough vaccine to vaccinate most of the people in the world.
You have mentioned SARS and MERS. SARS we remember quite well. MERS, not so much. It was only in Saudi Arabia, and it killed fewer people, some hundred at least still. So SARS developed, 8,000 people have been, I guess, affected, or there were cases of 8,000, and then suddenly disappeared. What happened there?
Some people say, well, SARS burned out. The original SARS burned out. But SARS didn't burn out. SARS was stopped by fast, good science, fast, good public health. It came out of southern China, as I said. It got to Hong Kong. It got to a hotel in Hong Kong, one particular hotel, the Metropole Hotel, one particular floor, the 9th floor of the Metropole Hotel. There was one man, a doctor from southern China, who came to Hong Kong for his nephew's wedding. He got very sick, and on the 9th floor of that hotel, either he coughed, maybe in the elevator, or he vomited, or he did something, so that people in other rooms on the 9th floor of the Metropole Hotel got exposed, got infected. They left the hotel and flew home from their vacations. Some of them flew home to Toronto, some flew to Beijing, some flew to Singapore, and they took SARS with them. So suddenly there was an outbreak in Singapore, and there was an outbreak in Toronto. Outbreak in Beijing happened a little bit later. A lot of people were infected quickly because it was a new virus and they didn't understand it. So there were cases that we call super spreaders, where someone would become very sick and would be coughing and choking. And so medical people, healthcare workers, would come and try to intubate him. So there might be 15 or 20 people trying to save this one man. He's coughing and coughing and choking, and they're trying to get a tube down his throat. And they don't realize that he's coughing out this highly infectious virus, a new virus that they've never been vaccinated against. So then a number of healthcare workers got infected, heavily infected during this first SARS. It heavily hit healthcare workers for that reason. But then it was stopped because they recognized that it was a coronavirus. They saw how dangerous it could be. They started giving healthcare workers proper PPE, isolating cases, tracing contacts. And it was no coincidence that the cities that SARS went to were cities of strong government with good healthcare systems. Toronto, Singapore, Beijing, Bangkok, Hanoi. Strong government that was able to say to people, okay, we're gonna isolate cases, and if you're a contact, you're gonna be on mandatory quarantine. They did that, and they stopped SARS. 8,000 people infected, as you said, 774 deaths, and then came MERS a little bit later, and then came this one. So, but this virus is more dangerous than the original SARS virus, because in the original SARS virus, there was no spreading that we know to any great degree, spreading of people who didn't have symptoms. No infectiousness before the illness. In this case, we do have that. It makes it so much more dangerous than SARS.
What's your opinion about the measures and decisions of the governments around the world? If you look first to your government, then to Europe, Africa, Brazil. Yeah. So
this is a very
analyzed so many virus and zoonosis.
Well, you mentioned with MERS that MERS came out of the Arabian Peninsula, and people haven't heard much about it, except MERS in 2015 got to South Korea and infected a number, because one man was visiting this Arabian Peninsula and he flew back to the Republic of Korea, and he took MERS with him, and he infected a number of people, and people died. So one of the reasons that South Korea was ready for this event was because they very vividly remembered MERS from 2015. Likewise, Singapore was ready. They remembered SARS from 2003. Strong public health, isolation of cases, quarantining of contacts, mandatory enforced quarantining of contacts. Things you can do if there's a strong government, things you can't do if there's a different sort of political culture. Okay, my country, terrible response, unbelievably bad response. The most surprising thing about this whole event to me is how pathetically unprepared the United States has been. And now we're leading the world in cases and leading the world in deaths. There's no excuse for it. And it's, our political leadership, they heard the warnings. We have good scientists. We have good public health people. They were saying, watch out for a pandemic. You need to be prepared. You need to spend money and political will on preparedness. It didn't happen, especially under this administration. Things were done in the last 3 years that reduced our preparedness rather than strengthening our preparedness. And don't get me started on our president, because I will say things that I probably shouldn't say. But it was very, very disappointing, shameful. Other countries, Italy was hit very hard. I don't think Italy's responses necessarily were shameful. I think Italy was very unlucky, and they had a lot of infected people who came into northern Italy, probably through the Milan airport, very early on, spreading infection without showing symptoms. That's my guess what happened to Italy. Germany responded very strongly at first, and you were very successful in controlling it. And I know you've got more cases now. It's a difficult disease to stop, and it's also difficult to maintain the closure of economies and social distancing for an indefinite period. So I recognize the difficulties. The United Kingdom did not do well. Spain has been hit very hard. I don't know enough yet about the Spanish responses to say what happened there. Brazil, they have a president who in some ways is as bad as our president. And he has been denying the seriousness of this, and that certainly hasn't helped the situation in Brazil. So that's, and in China got it under control. Firm government, really, really rigorous, stringent measures in Wuhan and Hubei province. Now, you couldn't do some of those things in the United States because there's a tradition of civil liberties and individual freedom. And where I live out in Montana, the cowboy ethic and rugged individuals, people won't accept that sort of thing. So there's a very complicated conversation that we have to have about the balance between public health and individual liberties. That's going to be going on, I hope, as we continue to deal with this.
Let's move to another aspect. You said that in the last 60 years, the number of zoonotic diseases increased. The last 60 years, the industry spread, the population, the urbanization, but also the destruction of nature and natural ecosystems. So there are opinions, and you have said it, wrote it also in your book, Spillover. I had a look in the book. You connect the increase of zoonosis also to ecological destruction. What say the researchers? I'm sure you have looked to many different researchers, analyzers. Can you say more how it has been, this relation?
Yes, and this is an important point. I'm glad we've come to it. Yes, the fundamental cause of these spillovers that become outbreaks, in some cases they become epidemics or pandemics, the fundamental cause is a single large cause, and that is there are now 7.7 billion humans on this planet. We're smart, we're hungry, we want resources for ourselves. We take those resources from the rest of the natural world in terms of what we eat, in terms of what we wear, in terms of the consumer items that we have, like a cell phone, laptop, computer, the amount of fossil fuel that we consume as we travel, the number of children that we have, if we have children. All of those choices have an effect on our footprint, our individual footprint on the natural world. And the bigger that footprint is, the more disruption of diverse ecosystems there is, the more contact there is with wild animals and therefore with new viruses, because all wild animals carry viruses that we don't even know about. We just know that they are there. And scientists have measured that, and they're continuing to measure the number of unique viruses that live in wild animals all over the world. And most of those are not potentially harmful to humans, but some of them are. More viruses out there. So as we continue disrupting the world and eating it and consuming it in all ways, we bring ourselves into contact with those viruses. And because we live in crowded cities and we travel quickly and frequently, those viruses, once they're in us, can travel all over the world and infect many, many humans. This virus now has become one of the most successful viruses in the world in Darwinian terms, because it's gotten all over the world.
In 2 days, we will have another event with two climate justice activists from two known German movements, and we will speak with them more about this relation. Mm-hmm. And we try to ask the question, what kind of economy, society, and mobility, and so on, we should try to develop, that the nature is not destroyed, that also pandemics and epidemics can be prevented. So it's a big question, of course, but you say there's a clear relation to the destruction of nature.
Can I say something about climate justice? Your forthcoming panel or event on climate justice. That's very important. And I didn't mention that when I was talking about how hungry we are, all 7.7 billion of us. So we consume a lot. And the size of the population multiplied by the rate of consumption, and then multiplied again by technology, which might either be a factor that increases or decreases the impact, that equation, that very simple equation, is what results in the impact that we have on the natural world. But it's important to remember that there is great injustice and great disparity in terms of how much people consume in different societies, different parts of the world, different communities around the world. So people say, well, there's an African, family and they have 8 kids. They have too many kids. They're causing, too much destruction of the rainforest. Well, those 8 kids in that African family, somewhere in a village in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, are consuming much less than probably one child in the United States or in Germany. So we can't just think about sheer population number and say, there's the fault there's the problem. We need to think about how much we consume and the disparity in wealth. Very, very important part of the whole problem and getting a handle on this. A relatively small number of people in affluent societies are consuming most of the resources on the planet, and the larger number of people are consuming much less, and therefore, even though their family size on average may be larger, their impact is smaller, and their standard of living is lower. So we need to think about not just environmental justice, but the income disparity, the wealth disparity, and the disparity of impacts on the natural world of different people around the world.
These are issues about which we are also thinking a lot. I mean,
sure. Yeah, I'm sure.
Social justice issues, very relevant. So in your book, Spillover, you say this is not the last pandemic. So what we can expect in the near or future or in the next decades?
Well, the scientists that I talk to and that I trust are warning us that this is not the last of this kind of an event. There are many more viruses out there, as I've said. We humans are continuing to come into contact with the animals that carry them because we're continuing to go into wild ecosystems and extract things, and including live, in some cases, live animals captured for food, taken to markets, which is a very, very dangerous practice. But all of these activities expose us to more viruses. So we can be sure that there will be more spillovers. Virus passing from a wild animal into a human, and then probably almost certainly more outbreaks, meaning once the virus passes into a human, that human infects another human, and there's a cluster of cases, maybe a dozen or 24 cases in a remote village or a town in the American Southwest or in the Congo or in Southeast Asia or somewhere. What we have to work on is the ability to stop an outbreak before it becomes an epidemic. We can do that with with sophisticated systems and technologies of surveillance so that we detect these events when they're still small. We get an alert that there are 15 people in southeastern Cameroon who are sick from a mysterious fever, and it's not malaria. We've tested for malaria. It's something else. Seems to be a new virus. The alert goes out, and healthcare workers arrive in southeastern Cameroon to help those people and to contain that outbreak before it gets to Douala, before it gets to Yaoundé, before it gets to Kinshasa, before it gets to Frankfurt. Control that before the outbreak turns into a larger event. We can do that. So in terms of, will there be a next pandemic? All I can say, based on the science that I know, is that there will certainly be future pandemic threats. There's a possibility that we can meet those threats and prevent the outbreaks from becoming pandemics if we have the political will and the understanding to invest the resources to do that. So I'm hopeful that maybe that's what we will do.
Okay, then let's have the first question from the audience. There's a question from L. This person asks, why are bats so often the reservoir hosts? Bats, in German, Fledermaus.
Fledermaus, yeah. This is something that my friend Fabian Leendertz of the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin has worked on. And Fabian and I have spent time together with his team in Ivory Coast. I was observing some of his research looking for the reservoir host of Ebola. He had a hypothesis that it might be in a particular form of small bat. So Fabian Leendertz is one of the scientists to whom I pay great respect and attention on this kind of subject. What I hear from the scientists is that bats, first of all, bats are a very diverse group of animals. I think it's either 20 or 25% of all species of mammal on Earth are species of bats. So they seem to be overly represented as reservoir hosts, but they are overly represented as in the diversity of mammals. So that's one factor. There's something like 1,200 species of bats, each with unique viruses, lots of potential viruses. Secondly, they're mammals like us. They don't look very similar to us, but they are mammals. They live long lives, especially for small animals. They could live 18 or 20 years, a little thing the size of a mouse. A mouse is lucky to live 1 or 2 years. They roost in dense aggregations, so you might find 60,000 small bats huddled together on the wall of a cave, 3 bats deep, mothers with pups at their breasts. And that's a great circumstance for circulating viruses through the population. That plus living long lives, circulating viruses. It's perfect for circulating viruses. And finally, there is evidence that their immune systems are more tolerant of alien forms, of alien DNA, of alien protein, less responsive to the alarm bells that ring for immune systems. And that's probably true for complicated reasons that have involved the fact that they fly, and it costs them great physiological stress to be the only mammal that's truly a flying mammal. So their immune systems, it is hypothesized, their immune systems have evolved to be less responsive to alien objects in their bodies. And you put those things together, and those are probably the explanations for why bats are or seem to be overly represented as reservoir hosts. And of course, the solution is not that we should go and kill bats. Bats are crucial parts as well as beautiful parts of ecosystems. The solution is that we should give bats their space. We should leave bats alone.
Of course, we should not try to eliminate any animal. So there's a discussion about the white animal markets in China and East Asia, and I followed in many media that there's a critic, and people request that China should close them finally, and they consider it as the main source of these diseases. But Would that help? I mean, in the Western states, people eat also some wild animals. It's not only Chinese people. We eat also wild animals.
You're right that we should not consider it a moral distinction between the way we eat wild animals and the way Chinese people eat wild animals. I live in Montana. People go out with a rifle, they kill a deer, they kill an elk, they kill birds, wild birds, they eat them. And in Montana, we call that game. I don't know what the term is in German, but when people in Africa kill wildlife and eat it, we call that bushmeat. And there's sort of a negative onus on that. Oh, bushmeat, you shouldn't eat bushmeat. When people in China do it, we talk about the wet markets. Let's talk about the wet markets. I've been to some of these wet markets in China when I was researching my book. When you say wet market, what people think immediately is, oh, wildlife and viruses and risk of disease. But these wet markets contain much more than that. They are important sources of fresh food for people who live in cities and other places. A wet market in China typically contains a lot of vegetables and fruit, seafood, alive and dead, domestic animals, alive and dead, chickens, ducks, pigs, meat, pork and beef. They tend to be messy. People are butchering animals right there. There's blood flowing, there's water flowing. It's a relatively unhygienic situation. If you add to that wild animals that have been captured from the wild and brought in cages, then you create an extremely dangerous situation, because those wild animals can be carrying dangerous viruses, and those viruses will fly on the breath of the animal or on the urine of the animal or the feces of the animal, and can get into other animals, for instance, get into a pig, get into a chicken, get onto a piece of pork, or simply pass directly from themselves, the wild animal, into humans. So there is pressure on China to close the wet markets. But what we really should care about is persuading China. They have already closed this, but to persuade them to continue to close and to enforce the closures of capturing wild animals from the wild, bringing them live to these markets. That is what is most dangerous about this. And that's what's different from for instance, somebody in Montana who shoots a deer and it's dead in the field, and he butchers it and he brings it home and he and his family consume it. I'm not saying that that's without moral valence. Vegetarians and vegans would say that does have moral valence, and I respect that. But it's not as dangerous in terms of pathogens as capturing a wild animal and putting it in a market with lots of other animals for food. Did you go to China? Did you see these wet markets? And are these wet markets traditional? Yes, I did go. When I was researching my book and saw wet markets in China, I also have seen them a number of times in Africa while I was researching my book and before. There is a division there. Some of this is traditional usage and some of it is subsistence. For instance, the small markets that I've seen in Africa have been mostly people living close to the forest and needing protein and either killing wild animals for themselves or buying wild animals at a local market and eating them. But there is also a vogue. There's a middle class fashion, a middle class and wealthy class fashion for eating wild meat. In China, this exists. It's called Yewei, and that means wild flavor or wild tastes. It exists in some of the cities in Africa, and it exists even in the U.S. There are people in the U.S. who import wild animal meat from Africa to eat it. So there is both a subsistence and there is a fashion. And some people say, well, in China, this is an ancient practice, eating pangolins or eating other animals. But a colleague of mine, a young Chinese journalist named Wu Fei Yu, researched that for an op-ed in the New York Times, and he went to some of the ancient Chinese sources, and he found the ancient Chinese sources saying, no, you should not eat wild meat. You should not eat pangolins. That's dangerous for you. You should not do that. So he was challenging in a very effective way this idea that, that it was an ancient, revered tradition in China to eat pangolins and other wild meat. Wu Fei Yu, an op-ed entitled Revenge of the Pangolins in the New York Times.
There's a question from a person called Berina who have read your book, Spillover. She says, you propose to survey better wild animals in order to better understand the potential pathogens. For this, more funds would be necessary, or now this is maybe politically possible. Would this survey mean more risk for animals, or would they help to conserve animals better?
Good question. Well, to survey wild animals for viruses does not probably represent a risk for wild animals, either as individuals or as populations, because most of that surveying can be done in a way that's not harmful to the animals. They can be sampled with swabs, just the way we get a swab to test us, a swab, an oral swab or an anal swab, and then they can be released. Or a blood sample can be taken from them very carefully and then released. And I've seen this happen many times. I've spent time with the scientists in the field who do this, the disease detectives. Many of them are trained as both as veterinarians and as ecologists. They might have a veterinary degree and they might have a PhD in ecology. They love animals. They do this work partly because they love animals. So I have seen people like the scientist Jonathan Epstein from EcoHealth Alliance capturing giant fruit bats in Bangladesh, taking blood samples, looking for Nipah virus. I was with him on the roof of a warehouse in the middle of the night, capturing these things in Bangladesh. And then in the morning, we went to a little makeshift lab, and he and his colleagues drew blood. And then they released these bats very gently and harmlessly. Why? Because they're interested in this subject, but they also love animals. So it can be done. Now, there is also some debate as to whether the funds for research should be spent on surveying wild animals sort of wholesale to look for new viruses that might be dangerous, or to create the systems of surveillance that I described before, so that you didn't necessarily know every virus that was in the forest, but when a new virus got into humans and caused trouble, 10 cases, 12 cases, 2 deaths, you could respond very quickly to that. So those are sort of 2 branches of preparedness. And there is some discussion among scientists that I respect on both sides, as to whether both of those are valuable, or whether the funding should be allocated to surveillance without spending so much money simply on discovering the thousands of viruses that are out there.
One more question from Ellen. She asked, why the structural reasons for the zoonosis, especially the ecological destruction, is not so much discussed in the public, especially at least in Germany or Europe, but people with conspiracy theories are more in the focus of the big media.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Ellen. Why are conspiracy theories conspicuous in the media? I think it's because conspiracy theories are exciting. They're dramatic. They satisfy people's political biases. They have no scientific support, but they're interesting stories. There are good guys and bad guys. So it appeals to this very, very simple desire for exciting narratives, and also the feeling that people get, the feeling of satisfaction that people get when they say, oh, I'm looking at the world, but I see what's really going on. I see something that you don't see because you're not smart enough to have picked up this conspiracy theory. I read something on the web that said that this virus was manufactured in a laboratory, and you don't realize that. So I have knowledge that you don't have. but those people don't realize that they don't have knowledge. They just have a rumor that has been put up on the web, invented and then magnified and repeated and amplified. But if you look at those things, and I have looked at them, there's no scientific evidence for them. So is it surprising that people embrace them? To me, it's not surprising, no, because that's human nature. Human nature likes excitement. Human nature likes sweet things. Human nature likes wine with a lot of sugar in it. Is it good for you? No. Is it quality wine? No. But people still like, you know, I don't mean to be hard on sweet wines. I'm all in favor of dessert wines. Let's just say that I have not come out against any fine Mosel dessert wines here. It was just an analogy.
Okay, thank you. I know a person, he's a biologist, and he has a tendency to conspiracy theories. But in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, he says, no, it's not possible. It's something biological, comes from the nature.
Good
Even
for
this
him.
person said it, so I said,
Good
okay.
for him. Good for him. Yes. Yeah.
So I guess we have no more questions, and we are coming to the end.
Okay.
So if you still have something to say, actually, you contribute so much.
Dankeschön. Thank you very much.
Yes, we are very happy.
I am honored and very pleased to have had the chance to talk with you and our participants today. It's a pleasure, and I hope you all have a good evening, and thank you for inviting me, Ercan.
It's a pleasure. I got the information that around 90 people watched it live.
Great.
Which is not bad, and it will be spread, and hopefully hundreds more will have a look in this interview, in this talk. And it's a contribution to the discussion. It's one important contribution. We discuss a lot the health system, the impact on the societies, sometimes how governments abuse this pandemic for their political interests, combined with even political repression in other states, especially in the southern ones. Anyway, but this aspect has not been treated so much. In the big media here in Germany, almost no one writes about it. If it's very short, and it's one of the 1,000 articles on this issue. So when I speak to people around me, usually they never have really discussed this issue. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And
I know what you're doing, and hopefully there will be a lot to read and listen.
Great. Thank you again, Ercan. Pleasure. Have a good evening. Okay.
Bye-bye.